Our first session is Teaching Equitably in English Composition, presented by Dr. Catherine Savini and Dr. Rachel Johnson. Catherine Savini is a professor in the English department, director in the Reading and Writing Center, and coordinator of the Writing Across the Curriculum program at Westfield State University in Massachusetts. Her work has been published in a variety of publications, including the Chronicle of Higher Education, Inside Higher Education, the Community Literacy Journal, and Praxis, a Writing Center journal. Rachel E. Johnson is the director of the Writing Center at the University of Mississippi and lecturer in the Department of Writing and Rhetoric. Her research draws on writing center pedagogy and practice, as well as issues of equity and access in higher education. She is interested in institutional and cultural norms surrounding writing and their effect on student perceptions of identity and ability. Welcome, Dr. Savini and Dr. Johnson.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Rachel Johnson. I'm excited to share a bit about the subject of equity in English composition with you today with my colleague, Catherine. We envisioned this session to be a brief introduction to some major themes of this scholarship and some practical applications to teaching and other practices in higher ed. And we also invite questions and discussion. So I want to share a little bit about how we got here. So Catherine and I were both asked to work with Every Learner Everywhere to write policy briefs aimed at an audience of leaders in higher education who want to learn more about how to promote equity in the context of English composition. So I wrote a sort of broad general introduction and overview of the subject. And Catherine also wrote another brief focused specifically on the area of combating linguistic bias and racism. And so I'm going to share a link to those policy briefs that we wrote so that you can take a look if you'd like. I want to start by just thinking a little bit about what the name of this presentation or panel is called. I think it was billed as Ask the Experts presentation. And I want to just say that I'm a little uncomfortable with the designation of expert. I think maybe we both are. While I certainly have a strong interest and dedication to promoting equity, inclusion, and social justice in higher education, and I'm actively engaged in this work on my campus, I also consider myself to be someone who's still very much learning from everyday experience, from other scholars, and of course from my students and mentees. And I think to do this sort of work and do it well, what I offer has to come from a place of humility. So what I was able to share in my brief broadly summarizes the work of countless scholars, many of whom are Black, Indigenous, people of color, whose work has not always been adequately appreciated or celebrated. So I just want to make that clear that I'm drawing on the work of many people, and I don't know that I would say I'm an expert. But my first and deepest commitment to equity and inclusion is a personal one, to be honest with myself and others, to acknowledge my position and privilege, and to continue to broaden my understanding of others and their lived experiences. So with that said, I'll share some personal reflections and information from the brief I wrote, and then I'll turn it over to Catherine to also share a little bit about hers before we take questions. Efforts to promote equity in composition generally start with the understanding that writing and communication are forms of power. In the Conference on College Composition and Communication statement describing scholarship in rhetoric, writing, and composition, it states that the power of language can give people voice, but it can also silence people. Language can be inclusive, but it can also exclude. It can break or sustain traditional stereotypes, biases, and hostilities. Colleges and universities operate within larger socio-political systems, and they inevitably reflect histories and enduring realities of marginalization and exclusion. And so the teaching and learning of writing is also informed by and influenced by these histories. I credit my work in writing centers with opening my eyes to issues of equity and access in higher ed. A writing center to me is a unique place on campus. Classrooms, student identities, institutional structures, all of those things collide. And I began my work in writing centers as a graduate student in Washington, D.C. In one of my first appointments, I had a student named Mai who told me that she was returning to college after 40 years to realize a lifelong dream of hers to graduate from college. And she was an immigrant to the US who learned English as a third or fourth language. And she came to see me because her instructor told her that she would fail her assignments if she had more than 4 grammatical errors in her writing. The instructor may or may not have had a good reason for this rule, or thought he had a good reason for this rule, but the disproportionate impact on a student like Mai was really troubling to me. Sometimes when we worked together, she was almost in tears, and other times she would sort of cut her eyes at me and she would slyly sort of say, like, how many languages does he know? And so she seemed to sort of take the fact that he highlighted her difference as a kind of challenge, but also I could see that it really affected her confidence and sense of belonging. And I think student success, we should know by now, hinges on understanding how certain practices, however well-intentioned, work to exclude and alienate those at the margins. Also, when I was working in that same writing center, I worked regularly for a time with a young male student who was working on a professional portfolio that he was compiling for a competitive Capitol Hill internship. And this included a very personal cover letter. He shared with me that the writing center was the only place he felt comfortable sharing his work because the piece included frank discussions of experiences with sexual assault and his emerging queer identity. He had faculty mentors on campus, but he worried that those faculty might not look at his story and see it as valued. And because the Writing Center was this sort of peer-based consultation service, he thought he could access writing expertise with a friendlier and perhaps more open-minded audience. Also, our center published pictures and biographies of consultants, and he recognized the sort of queer kinship in my personal details. And so I think although his assumptions about his faculty mentors may have been wrong, he couldn't find direct evidence to contradict them. And in both of these situations, I was glad that a place like the Writing Center existed on campus as a sort of social and academic intermediary. And I wanted to be part of creating more educational spaces of belonging like that. So that's sort of my personal kind of journey to this area of interest and of some of the work I do. Toward a new rhetoric of difference, Stephanie Kirschbaum calls for a dynamic, relational, and emergent conception of difference. Rather than viewing identity as a fixed category, she calls on researchers and practitioners to acknowledge the ways in which difference is negotiated in context. And I believe that the application of this insight is that student challenges in written communication must be paired with a careful examination of institutional practices. Colleges and universities can't necessarily prevent disparities in students' knowledge and skills, or their uneven access to resources for mental, emotional, and social well-being. But we can anticipate that these factor in our work and increase our understanding of the complexities of student experience. So composition theory and writing studies have often been at the forefront of critically examining how diversity impacts practices in higher education. Engaging with and acknowledging work from disability studies, queer theory, critical race theory, and linguistics. But we still need to continue to question standard pedagogical assumptions and practices, and ask ourselves, are we, whether we mean to or not, exacerbating and reproducing inequalities? And when we discover barriers to student success, are we making it not our students' responsibility to remove those barriers? I think, thankfully, there's a rich body of research out there for us to draw on. And like I said, I wrote the policy brief to be an overview of those contributions that have been made by various scholars. And in the interest of time and to allow for discussion, I want to share a link to those resources in that brief that I wrote, and now turn it over to Catherine, who's going to be discussing one of those areas of interest a little bit in more depth, linguistic diversity. So Catherine, you want to go ahead?
Thank you, Rachel. That was great. I'd like to start with a story of a moment that really made me understand the impact of linguistic racism on students. A few years ago, a student came into my writing center. I'm a writing center person too. And she was working on a paper assigned to her in a psychology class, and it was a reflective essay on her identity development. And she had received a high grade for her content, but a low grade for her writing. And I was immediately struck by her sentences. They were just really hard for me to understand. Here's an example of one. I didn't have an indistinguishable surface hair from different females in my class, and they wouldn't converse with me or simply give me disposition since I didn't seem as though them. I had a hunch that her primary issue was an over-reliance on the thesaurus, and so I asked her and she confirmed that it was. And when I asked her why she used the thesaurus, she said it was because the teachers she'd had in the past had told her not to write like she speaks. In this same paper, she talks about how she was mocked for speaking a second language. Her parents were immigrants from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, so she spoke Lingala. In the paper, she describes walking down the streets of Boston and having people following her making clicking noises, so she stopped speaking Lingala in public. So she used the thesaurus for every single sentence of this 6-page paper about her own identity development in an effort to meet the expectations of academic discourse. So she learned on the streets of Boston that that Lingala isn't welcome, and she learned in the classroom that her dialect of English wasn't welcome. Think of the labor required of this, that she used the thesaurus for every single sentence of this 6-page paper. But the labor doesn't pan out, doesn't work, and she's sent to the writing center to have her writing fixed. And so up until this moment, I feel like I understood what linguistic bias was intellectually because I'd read about it by way of Gloria Anzaldúa, James Baldwin, and Amy Tan. But it wasn't until this moment that I really began to feel the problem and realized that I should do something about it as a writing center director, writing across the curriculum coordinator, and as an instructor in the composition program, someone who teaches writing and someone who benefits from the privilege of being white, middle-class, native English speaker. The Congolese American student was experiencing what April Baker Bell calls anti-Black linguistic racism. She defined linguistic racism in general as any system or practice of discrimination, segregation, persecution, or mistreatment of language based on membership in a race or ethnic group. All BIPOC students who speak and write in dialects in languages other than mainstream white English are susceptible to linguistic racism. Our students are expected to code switch, which means they need to check their languages and dialects at the classroom door and adopt white mainstream English. And this sends a message to our students. It sends a message that their dialects and languages are not sophisticated enough for the task of academic discourse, and it often reinforces the message that they don't belong. And it's not surprising that code switching comes with social and psychological repercussions. Studies show that code switching can lead people in the in-group to feel as if they don't fit into their own group anymore, and they can be accused of acting white. It drains cognitive resources because it requires effort and promotes burnout. One study in 2020 focused on international students in Australia, and it demonstrated that linguistic racism can lead to a sense of non-belonging, low self-esteem, fear and anxiety over speaking English, depression, and even suicidal ideation. Of course, we all code switch, but the type of code switching expected of students of color who speak dialects and languages with features less like what we call standard English, it's a much heavier lift, and it exacts a higher cost. Linguist Rosina Lippi-Green wrote that discrimination based on language variation is so commonly accepted, so widely perceived as appropriate, that it must be seen as the last backdoor to discrimination. And the door, she writes, stands wide open. So as universities, we open the door to diversify our student bodies, but we tend to reject diversity when it comes to the English language. When it comes to English, we adhere to standards, and those standards reflect communication norms of white mainstream English. And this is a term that Baker Bell advances. And she's using that term to emphasize that it's not actually a standard. There is no standard because it's intermixing and dynamic, and it's defined by the dominant group. So what do we do about this? How do we change our teaching? There are some small and meaningful adjustments that we can make in our pedagogy. We can signal to multilingual and BIPOC students that multilingualism is valued. It's often framed as a deficit rather than an asset, as Rachel was recognizing. We can invite students to identify how many languages they speak and celebrate multilingualism. I often talk about how I'm monolingual and how I recognize that to be a disadvantage. We can invite students to find research articles when they're conducting research in other languages. This is one of my Puerto Rican students said to me, she's like, it's as if people think that research is only published in English. Let me find articles published in Spanish and integrate them into my research papers. We can provide feedback and assess equitably, which means not focusing on grammar, not taking points off for grammar, potentially using contract grading. We can ask students to investigate linguistic racism by providing readings and asking them to complete assignments that enable them to explore the power dynamics inherent in language use. We can recognize that anti-Black linguistic racism is a very particular form, and it's often considered justifiable. And it's integrally tied to the violence against Black bodies and rooted in slavery. And so we can make changes to our classroom to address this by not telling students, Black students, that they need to learn standard English to succeed and not penalizing them for using Black English in the classroom. With that student that I was speaking about at the beginning, I ended up emailing her professor and sending her some articles about linguistic racism. And I said, do you think she could rewrite this paper in her own dialect of English? And the professor said, sure, why not? It's a paper about her identity development. Since this happened 5 years ago, I think it was, I started really paying attention to linguistic racism, and I've noticed just how pervasive it is. Last year, during the pandemic, one of my kids' teachers sent home a YouTube read aloud. He's in 3rd grade. He was in 2nd grade last year, and we were watching this read aloud. So it's when somebody reads a children's book. And I noticed right away that the person had a Spanish accent. And my first thought was, oh, why would she send this home? It's so hard for my son to understand. And then I froze because I had been reading about, teaching about, writing about linguistic racism for years at this point, and I was still having these thoughts, right? And so it just was a moment that really crystallized for me how deeply embedded, baked in linguistic racism is in our systems and in our brains. So ultimately, we all benefit from reframing multilingualism as a resource and from inviting multiple languages and dialects into the academic sphere, because we'll become better communicators. We'll have more tools in our toolbox, and we can combat this insidious form of racism that leads so many of our BIPOC students to feel as if they don't belong on our campuses. Thanks. We're ready for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Savini and Dr. Johnson. I see we have a few questions from the audience, so go ahead and submit any additional questions in the Q&A tab. Our first question, and there were a couple related to this, is how do we support students without lowering academic expectations, especially if we know like in other classes they're going to have these expectations?
I mean, one thing I would say is don't penalize students and recognize the power dynamics that are at play. Let students know. So for instance, in the Writing Center, when students used to come in with a paper and I would notice grammatical errors, I would prioritize them, figure out which ones were impeding meaning the most, and then help them fix those errors, right? But now I add to that a conversation where I say, do you want to fix these? The truth is, I can understand what you're saying. It's possible, though, that your professor is going to mark you down. So it's your choice. And so I just want them to be aware and conscious and making the choice themselves.
Great. A couple of people are asking, can you elaborate on contract grading? Yes.
I'm going to throw a link in the chat, but Savini has 2 books which are awesome, and they're open access, and he details a particular approach to contract grading, and it's an approach that's a labor-based approach, which means that it doesn't focus on quality at all. It focuses on the amount of time students spend on the work and on the fact that they complete the work. And so at the beginning of the semester, there's a negotiation between the students and the professor. And then there's a contract. The students sign it. They identify what grade they want to get. And I have been using it for the past 3 years. At first, it was a huge leap. It was really hard to get used to. But now I wouldn't go back, because the work that my students have done under contract grading, I think, far exceeds the work that they did when they were getting grades based on their, quote, quality of their writing. And they also, in my class, they reflect, they keep track of the work they're doing, and they reflect on it. And they reflect on, for instance, what time of day they write the best, what they struggled with as they were revising. So it's one of those really daunting, sort of radical changes that you can make to your class. But I will say that I've been presenting it on my campus as the Writing Across the Curriculum coordinator to faculty from across the disciplines. And now biology professors and math professors are using it. So it's not just like a touchy-feely humanities thing. And they are loving it, because what they're getting is a glimpse into the thinking that's going on behind the scenes, and they're seeing like where students are struggling. And oftentimes it's like, oh, you only thought this assignment should take 45 minutes. Well, this assignment should take 4 hours, right? And so it's really taken off on my campus as a way to assess students equitably. I couldn't recommend it enough.
Right, and I'll just add to that one way to think about doing some contract grading too is to, if it feels like too much of a lift, you can do portions of your course as having kind of a contract or labor-based grade. And I think that's one way that we acknowledge what we teach about writing as a process, and how helping students engage in that process and see the benefits of it. So I've done this before, where I've taken a class and just one semester done one element of their grade as sort of a labor-based grade, and then went and rewrote the course in the summer when I had a little bit more time to, take what I'd learned from that and implement it in a more, complete way. So it doesn't always have to be that big heavy lift that Catherine mentioned about, like, it changes the whole flavor of the course.
Yeah, that's a great point. And a bunch of faculty on my campus have done it for just a single assignment, right? And then after they get a taste of it, they often dive in fully. So it's a great way to experiment with it. And there's different kinds of contract grading. It's worth noting Peter Elbow advances a particular version of it, but Savini is the one I would recommend if you're new to this.
Great. So this is kind of a related question. How do we get other faculty across disciplines to support such strategies?
That's such a good question. So a few things that I've been doing on my campus is one is in one of my courses, I had students, they were really motivated to do this, to create a video where they talked about their experiences being multilingual on our campus. And it was really powerful. It's a 20-minute video, and so I've started sending it out around the campus. I also organized a panel where students and faculty and staff got together and talked about their experiences. And they all had plenty of stories where they felt that their multilingualism was framed as a deficit. So, for instance, a story where a professor told a Spanish-speaking student that her sentences were too long. And the student said, well, that's how we write in Spanish. And the professor said, well, you're not in Puerto Rico anymore. There were other stories where students talked about how when they entered an academic building, if they were speaking Spanish to each other outside the building, as soon as they walked in the doors, they would start speaking English, right? So a panel, a video, I started sending out syllabus statements to the campus on that value multilingualism and asking people to add those to their syllabus. And I run reading groups. So reading groups with short articles about linguistic racism. And reading groups on my campus has been one of the most effective ways to lead people to change, because you're not being didactic, you're letting people sort of come to it on their own.
These are great strategies. Our last question is, how might the COVID-19 crisis impact how we think about equity in English and compositional instruction?
Yeah, I think this is probably on a lot of our minds right now. I think that for me and in my institution, I think one of the things that we focused on was thinking about how do you design, once we got out of the initial sort of mid-semester change that we went through, in spring of 2020, how do you design a course from the beginning with access and equity in mind? And so I think, looking at principles of universal design is one way to, think about how you can create a resilient course where if there are crises that pop up, you've already sort of thought through possibilities and how the course can change and maybe even already plan for those things. I think when it comes to the post COVID-19 world, we'll be thinking less about that in terms of online, but I think that having taught online or in these hybrid formats will inform a lot of that work. I don't know, Catherine, I don't want to take the last word here, so if you have some thoughts there.
Yeah, I'll add to that too. I have been diving into the reading on trauma-informed pedagogy because it seems as if many of our students have experienced this pandemic as a trauma, or it's brought up past traumas. And one of the things that I've learned that is most valuable is community building. And so I'm doing things in my classes on Zoom that I never would have thought that I would do to build community, and just providing opportunities for students to connect. So when I put them in breakout rooms, I say, don't get right to work. Spend a little time talking to each other and getting to know each other. And sometimes I'll even give them a prompt for some silly conversation that they can start with, because I want them to have that opportunity to connect with each other. Also, I think it's really important if we provide students the opportunity to develop guidelines for how we're all going to communicate with each other in class. And so instead of saying to students, I'm going to grade you on participation and here's how you should participate, I ask my students to indicate what constitutes participation, what has prevented them in the past from participating, and how can we work together to level those barriers to participation. The other thing I started doing this year that I never would have thought of is I start at every class with guided breathing. I just play a YouTube video and we do guided breathing together, and it's been as good for me as it has for them. And every time I check in and say, do you want to keep doing this? They say, yes, please, we need to keep doing this. So anything that we can do to promote positive mental health and also destigmatize conversations about mental illness and anxiety and depression.
Thank you so much, Dr. Savini and Dr. Johnson.